Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is Resalest Book Review Part 1. My biggest interest in life probably has been reading books, mostly fiction, literature, and, well, now mostly history. And some people in my family have said, well, Peter, all he does is read books all day. Well, and there's some truth to that, for what they're saying. But anyway, so I've had a lot of enjoyment reading books. It's given me, I find reading books interesting, and there's drama. I find there's inspiration and empowerment, and I find them entertaining, interesting, enjoyable. So anyway, now, like a lot of people, my memories from school with regards to books is not very positive. I have some painful memories also of books because, when you're in school, the teacher chooses what you're going to read. And you don't get to choose. And often, the books are too hard. So many people, for this reason, actually hate books, and they never read a book after they get out of school. And it's tragic, I think. So what's important is choosing the book that you like and something that's not too hard. Otherwise, it's going to be a bad experience, and you won't want to do it. So anyway, when I was 26, I really became into it. Just sort of happened as a young man. I got into a lot of trouble, and then for some reason I started reading books, and I found it helped me stay out of trouble, and it was enjoyable. I enjoyed reading books. So we'll get started. Okay, the first book is by John Steinbeck. It was first published in 1939, and it's The Grapes of Wrath. It's a novel. It's an incredible book. In fact, this was the book, I believe, that got me hooked on reading books, and it's amazing, an amazing story. This takes place in the 1930s with this family who is poor, named the Joad family in Oklahoma. And they're farmers, and they borrowed money they had to borrow money, and eventually they lost their land because the loan got too big and they couldn't pay, and so they had to leave. So this was very hard for them, It's about the Depression in the United States. So they had to hit the road and go to California with all their belongings in a big truck, and they really had a tough time. And the story is so engaging. This family, the mother and father and the older brother, and then the sister and so forth. It's a very, you really feel for this family and what they're going through. Really, the tough times, very tough times. Having to leave home, and then when they get to California, they work as migrant farm workers, and it's real hard. They have a very tough life, and the family starts falling apart. Different people. Grandparents, I think, died, and then there's such a strain on these people. Made a good movie with Henry Fonda and others, and it's wonderful. I found it very, very engaging. Really captured my attention, and you're living with this family, and today in California you have these Mexican immigrants who are doing this type of work. It's a tough life. So that's a wonderful book, The Grapes of Wrath. Okay, the second book was by Victor Hugo. It was published in 1831, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Another incredible book. Wow, what a story, incredible. And they have these characters, Quasimodo, the Hunchback, who's living in the church in Notre Dame in Paris, France. And then there's this Esmeralda, the gypsy girl, who's this very beautiful girl, and then Quasimodo falls in love with her. Then you have Claude Frollo, who's a pretty bad guy. He's a priest, pretty bad guy, and he's like the villain. And then there's this La Sachette, who's another very interesting character in it. And then there's a soldier. It's an amazing story. It really, really gets your attention, and it's there's a lot of excitement and danger and tragedy, and it's a heartbreaking story. They made a Disney movie a few years ago, and they had to, it's Disney, so they had to have a happy ending. But in the real book, it has a very, very sad ending with Quasimodo and so forth. So that's a wonderful, wonderful book, and very, very really powerful. Okay, the next book was written by Anne Frank, and it was published in 1947. It's called The Diary of Anne Frank, and this is an amazing book. It was written by this girl in Amsterdam, Holland, during the Second World War, and they were a Jewish family from Germany, and they had to flee the Nazis who were persecuting Jews, and eventually killed 6 million Jews who were killed. And so this, and then then Holland was occupied, the Netherlands, and so they had to go into hiding. And so this book is her diary that she wrote. It's her actual diary of this girl, and she was like 13, 14, 15, 16, something like in those years. And it's tough, because they have to keep quiet. They can't go outside. They're stuck inside, and they have to keep quiet, especially during the day. And even at night, they have to keep quiet because they don't want to get caught. And there's the mother and father, and then the sister, and there's another couple and their son, and so she's talking about and she's just a girl. She's just, an adolescent girl, and describing her perceptions of what's going on and the challenges they had in relationships with her mother, and then she has this, young love with this boy Peter, who's also there, and it's a wonderful story. And then the best line is when Anne writes, here she's, they're fearing for their lives, and she writes, despite everything, I believe deep at heart that people are good. I'm paraphrasing that. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but and then actually they were caught. They were caught, and the Nazis came, and they were all taken away. They were all taken to the death camps, and they all died except for the father, Otto Frank. And Anne died very tragically just before the liberation of her camp, at the end of the war in like April of 1945. Very, very sad. And the father came home to his home, and his wife had died, his 2 daughters had died, and then his apartment, the place had been ransacked. But he found Anne's diary, and he was, an adult, busy with his life, and he didn't really know what Anne was going through. And then, he read her diary, and and his daughter who had died, and she died. She was 16, and I felt so sad at the end because I had a 16-year-old sister who died also, named Pamela, and so it kind of reminded me of her. The father decided to publish this diary, and it's world famous. It's a very popular book, and you can go. It's a tourist attraction, going to the home where Anne lived, and it's been translated into many languages, and so she has such a positive attitude, such a wonderful spirit, and it became a very popular book, and and just imagine Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were so powerful, but they were defeated. Hitler died, the Nazis lost the war, but here this Anne Frank, you think a young girl, and she was just this nobody, but she became world famous. God bless Anne Frank. Wonderful book. The next book is by Leo Tolstoy. It was written in 1867, and it's called The War and Peace. Now, this is a very long book. It's more than 1,000 pages, and it's a tough book to read, and you have to kind of plow through it. But there are parts that are really, really incredible. Really amazing parts in that book, and especially it's set in Russia during the time of Napoleon, and it depicts the Napoleon's and the French invasion of Russia. And that's, I think, the most dramatic part. And then they get to Moscow. And the French army, Napoleon thinks, this is his moment of glory, taking Moscow. The thing is, the Russians had pulled out. They had pulled out, and it was empty. And they set fires. The city was on fire. And then the French troops they became very unruly, and they just started, looting and going for all these silver and gold objects and so forth. And then winter was coming, so the Russians had to. There was no food, so they were retreating back to France, and they all died. Virtually, almost the entire army starved to death, and they were so that's part of this book. It's really an amazing book. And Leo Tolstoy, who's probably the most famous Russian writer. Tough reading. I taught that at Resalest Educational Center, and school year ended 1993-94, and we took the whole year. we read that book. I mean, almost the whole year. It took three quarters into the fourth quarter of the school year, and the students were they were very good. You know, they had that Pinoy patience and endurance, and they stayed with it. The next book is by Margaret Mitchell. It was published in 1936, and the book is Gone with the Wind. This is a wonderful book, a tremendous book, and it's pretty easy to read, not too tough, and a great story. It's set in the United States during the Civil War, and before the Civil War and after. So that would be like around 1860s. The 1860s in Georgia, and you have these amazing characters. Scarlett O'Hara, who's this really outgoing and very very energetic and bold and brave, and so forth. And she's kind of selfish, but very 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 strong woman, And then there's Rhett Butler, who's played by and then the movie is wonderful. Rhett Butler, who's this funny guy and kind of he's got money and he's a cool guy and kind of likes to joke around, and he and Scarlett have an amazing relationship in the story, because he's always kidding Scarlett and she gets mad at him and stuff like that, and she's in love with Ashley, another guy who's kind of a dreamer, and it's set in the Civil War, during the Civil War, so this is a very dramatic story, wonderful story, very entertaining, and good history as well. Great book. The next book was written by James A. Michener. Came out in 1983. It's called Poland. Now, when I moved to the Philippines, I very much miss my father, John Esra. I have a very good father, and James Michener. I read quite a few of his books. He became like a father figure to me, and he writes these historical novels. Very very long, not too hard, but they are pretty long, and so you get a sense. They're historical novels. So in this case, this is about Poland. The history. It's a story. It's a novel, but you also get the history of Poland going way, way back. He'll take you way, way back. And he's a very wholesome writer. He's positive, and you feel good reading his books because they're uplifting. Okay, the next book was written by Herman Hesse, and it came out in 1922, and this is Siddhartha. And it's a short book, and it's pretty easy to read, and it's about Lord Buddha, from the founder of Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama, also known as Lord Buddha. And this is the story of his life, and as the prince, and how he decided to walk away, and he became disillusioned by life, by the realities of life, that we grow old and there's poverty and there's sickness and suffering and death. So he decides to discover the mystery of life, and he goes off and he practices austerities, and eventually sits under a banyan tree for 8 years, meditating and trying to solve the mystery of life. And he achieves union with God. He becomes a great saint, and then he goes off helping people, and encouraging them to seek God as well, so that they can overcome the suffering in their own lives. So this is a wonderful story that Herman Hesse, this German writer, made into a story that's very, very entertaining and engaging. And it's based on this great man, this incredible man in history, Lord Buddha. The next book was written by Lucy Maud Montgomery. It's a Canadian author, and it came out in 1908. The title is Anne of Green Gables. Wonderful book. In fact, there's I think there's like 10, and it's the first of a series of 10. And this is a pretty easy book to read. It's not too long, and it's set in Prince Edward Island, Canada, and and it's a very wholesome story. It's about this simple life, farming. Anne is an orphan who's adopted by an older brother and sister. And, she has a very strong spirit, a wonderful spirit. She's very outgoing and creative and interesting. And she gets into trouble because she's so, she's so outgoing and inquisitive and so forth. And she has adventures, but, she's a very good person. She's very wonderful, has a wonderful spirit. And, is pretty smart, works hard. And she develops a very loving relationship with Matthew and Marilla, this older pair, older brother and sister, and Anne's in school and so forth. And there was a great scene when Anne was with her friend, and her friend says, "Oh, when I'm rich, I'm going to live in a hotel and eat chicken salad and ice cream every day." And I love that, that scene. And whenever we go to Lakeside, Ohio, they have this old hotel, and I think of that scene. Wonderful story, and the sequels are also very good. They're very wholesome and positive and entertaining, and about the old days, farm life, a simpler time. Okay, the next book was written by Charles Nordhoff and James Norman Hall. Two guys teamed up. Came out in 1932. The title is Mutiny on the Bounty. Wow, what an incredible book. This is the story, a true story, of Captain Bligh and this HMS Bounty that left Great Britain. And this was during, set way back during 1700s, I believe. And they were or maybe the 1800s, but anyway, way back. And they were looking they wanted to go to Tahiti in the South Pacific to get breadfruit, which they thought could be brought to the Caribbean and used to feed their slaves in Jamaica. I think that was the idea. And so that was the whole purpose of the trip. And so, they're on this ship, the Bounty, and Captain Bligh is a very, he's pretty tough. He's a kind of very strict captain. There are a couple movies. Charles Laughton played him in one. There's a newer version. And then he's disciplining the sailors. And then they make it a long trip to Tahiti in the South Pacific. And then they get there, and wow, and it's like a tropical paradise, nice and warm, and beautiful island. And they have these wonderful, friendly people, very, very friendly people. And the sailors, they end up, having girlfriends there. The women are very interested in them, and they establish relationships with these women. And then it's time to go back to England, and they get in the boat to go back. And they start on the way back, and then by this time they've just left paradise, and they're very unhappy, and they have a mutiny. And in the newer movie, it was Mel Gibson plays Fletcher Christian, who leads this mutiny. And they take over the ship, and they put Bligh in a small boat, and then they go back to Tahiti to get their wives, and because they don't want to go back to England, and so that's an incredible story. And the sequel is called Men Against the Sea. Came out 2 years later by the same authors, and this is the story of Captain Bligh and his what happened to him. And actually, he made it. You'd think he would have died. They just set him adrift in a small boat, but he made it all the way from not too far from Tahiti to Timor, East Timor Island in what's now Indonesia, or East Timor, which is independent. And they had a tough trip, but Bligh was very strong spirit, and they made it. And the third in the trilogy is Pitcairn Island. I think is the most interesting book, and because the mutineers after the mutiny said, "What are we going to do now? What can we do? We can't go back to England. Mutiny is punishable by death." So they knew that the British would be after them and looking for this. So they thought, we need to find a place where they won't find us. So they found this island, Pitcairn Island, and they settled there. They burned the Bounty because they thought this would, people, if sailors came by, they'd see this huge ship. So they were committed to staying there. And so they had their Tahitian wives, and there were some Tahitian men came along. And at first things were okay. And they did a lot of farming. They farmed the island. They were busy working. But then they ended up having a war between the Englishmen and the Tahitian men. And all the Tahitian men were killed, and a number of Englishmen were killed. And then by this time, there were children that had been born from these Tahitian women with the English fathers. And then all the Englishmen became alcoholic, and they're all drinking, and the women were doing all the work. So it was a pretty bad situation. And they all died of alcoholism except one Englishman. So you had one Englishman and all these Tahitian women, and then all these number of children. And the Englishman decided to commit suicide one day. But and then he had this inspiration. He saw these children he's sleeping by the cliff, and he thought, no, I have a responsibility to these children. I can't kill myself. So he knew there was a Bible. And so he started reading that Bible. He hadn't been much of a Christian, but he started reading that Bible. He had a wonderful spiritual experience. And then he ended up becoming a very strong Christian, and he taught the Tahitian women Christianity and the children, and then they developed this culture. And up till now, there's Pitcairn Island. There are people living there. Many of the descendants moved to New Zealand and Australia. And I actually wrote a letter to Pitcairn Island that they put on the bulletin board there, or notice board there. So I was so interested in that, and so that's a wonderful, wonderful story, Pitcairn Island. Okay, the next book was written by Willa Cather. Came out in 1918, and it's called My Antonia. This is a wonderful book. This is a classic novel, and it's a very peaceful book. It's easy to read, not too long. Very peaceful, very gentle. It takes place in the Great Plains, the area where states of Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, and so forth, and that the flat lands in the western part of the U.S. And way back when, this is so it's like more than 100 years ago, and it depicts life among these farmers, and it's very nice, and it shows their struggles with their with the land and with their relationships and so forth, and it's a very nice book, very nice, very easy to very very gentle and peaceful and beautiful book, wonderful book. Okay, and then another book by Willa Cather, O Pioneers, came out in 1913, and this is a similar type book, but just different characters and a different story, but also the same style. Very very easy to read, very nice, very 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 peaceful and gentle and beautiful and very very wonderful story. The next book was written by Leon Uris, and came out in 1958, and the title is Exodus. And this is a wonderful book, an amazing book. It's the story of the creation of Israel, and it's a very inspiring book because the background is the Jewish people. Most of the Jewish, there was a large Jewish population in Europe. Originally they'd been in Israel, then they dispersed to Russia, Europe, and then, they were coming to the U.S., but a very large population in Europe. And then, of course, the Nazi Germany, they tried to kill them all, and they killed 6 million of them. So after that, they decided, that they were fed up with this, what was going on. They thought we're not safe in Europe, and we have to have our own country where we can defend ourselves. They weren't allowed to join the armies of Europe, and so they were accused of being cowards. So anyway, so Israel was established in 1948, I believe, and around that time, and it was where these Jewish people moved there from Europe. Many of them who'd lost family members in the Holocaust, when 6 million Jewish people died. And it's a very inspiring story, and it talks about how they were the Arab states tried to wipe them out, destroy them, and failed. And up till Israel is a controversial country up till now, and a lot of these Muslim countries that they're dreaming about destroying Israel. This is what they want to do, and so it's tough. It's very controversial, and I'm sure a lot of Muslims would not like this book. But you hear of anti-Semitism. Well, I'm pro-Semitic. I think Jewish people are good people, and this Noni Darwish wrote a book. She said, the Muslims have a huge amount of land, and all these countries, big countries, and the Jews just want this small area. That's all they want, where they can, and so why can't we just let them be? And I think Israel has had a very positive influence on the Middle East, tried to be, despite all the hatred that's been heaped upon them, almost universal hatred on Israel from the Muslim world. The next book was written by Herman Wouk in 1971. It's called Winds of War. This is a pretty easy book to read. It's pretty long, and it's about the events leading up to the Second World War. And in Europe and in the Pacific, as Germany and Japan were preparing to establish empires and try to conquer the world. So that's what this book is about. And then they had a TV series on this. And then the sequel is War and Remembrance, also by Herman Wouk. And this is about the Second World War in Europe and in Asia. The German conquest of all of Europe, and then the Japanese conquest of Asia, a huge part of Asia. So this is a good book, and it has characters, and so forth. It's pretty easy to read. Okay, the next book is by James A. Michener, and this is his first book, I believe. And it came out in 1947, Tales of the South Pacific. I think this is probably my favorite book by him. And he was in the Second World War himself, and he's describing. It's actually a lot of it is the Second World War and the American experience, the American soldiers and sailors in the South Pacific, and the fighting the Japanese. And they made a musical about it as well, which I'm not crazy about. But anyway, this is a really good book. I highly recommend it. The next book was written by Charles Dickens, and it came out in 1838. It's called Oliver Twist, and this is a great book. It's a little bit tough, but it's a wonderful book, and it's about an orphan. This boy's Oliver Twist. He's an orphan, and he's in an orphanage. And it's all about, and Charles Dickens was very influential in Great Britain in fighting for a humane society, and fighting against all the cruelties, because these orphanages were very cruel, the way they were treating children. And my great-grandfather was in an orphanage way back when, and so there's a famous scene in the book where the children aren't being fed enough. They're hungry, and so they're given this like oatmeal for a meal. And Oliver comes up to the headmaster and says, "Sir, I want more." Well, that's a terrible thing. Consider a terrible thing. He gets punished severely for that, and eventually, so he has experiences, and it really is it's a great story. Oliver Twist. The story of this poor orphan boy in Great Britain, in England, close to 1838. So this is going way back. The next book is by Gustave Flaubert. It was written in 1856, and the title is Madame Bovary. And this is a pretty easy book to read. It's a wonderful story. It's a very dramatic and tragic. This character. Madame Bovary, and she's really, pretty selfish, and but she wants to be rich and everything, and she marries this guy who she considers dull. It's a really good story, and I highly recommend it. Not too tough. You can get through it fairly quickly. The next author is Jonathan Swift, who wrote a book in 1726. Now this is almost 300 years ago, called Gulliver's Travels. And wow, what a story. Gulliver's Travels, about this guy who comes to these places, where these 4 different worlds. One where the Lilliputians, this is where we get the word, a Lilliputian is someone who's very small. He comes to this island, and the people are tiny, tiny people. And then in another place, there are giants, the Brobdingnagians, these giant people. And then he goes to a place where there's the people are kind of crazy, and they're into math, and then they're not very practical, and so they do all these stupid things. And then the fourth country or world is like where there's like a flying islands in the sky. This is a very entertaining book. There's been I think a fairly recent movie about Gulliver's Travels, and it's really a good story. I highly recommend it. Okay, so we're about out of time. Thanks for watching. I hope those of you who hate books, maybe this video and the subsequent ones will put a little doubt in your mind that maybe books might be a good thing, and maybe you can find a book that you would like and enjoy reading. Because this is why I became a teacher, because I love reading books, and it's tragic that so many young people and adults hate books. So thanks so much for watching. God bless you. See you next time.